Hello, this is Ankita Acharya. I'm a LIMS implementation expert with cloudlims.com, and today I'll be talking about regulatory compliance and best practices and how a LIMS can actually help you in your laboratory stay ahead of the curve. Starting with, we'll be discussing about the regulatory compliance, the why and who of it. We'll be discussing about major compliance and best practices across different industries. We'll then talk about the benefits of using a LIMS and then just a summary of the key takeaways from the discussion. Starting with, let's talk about what is the regulatory compliance all about. Well, a regulatory compliance is a set of laws, regulations, guidelines that an organization needs to adhere to. They act as the moral compass to ensure a laboratory is legally and ethically sound. They are governed both nationally and internationally and may vary from one industry to another or one laboratory to another based on the industry's end goals. So who takes care of these regulatory compliance? Who addresses them? Who sets them? Those would be your regulatory agencies. So regulatory agencies are independent government body responsible for setting and enforcing the regulatory compliance required to govern regulatory laboratories and ensure that they adhere to the industry and international standards. Some of these regulatory agencies include the FDA, the ISO, the GDPR, and HIPAA. We will be discussing each of them a little more in detail shortly. So before we talk about the compliance and what are the requirements, let's understand why are they important. So why are regulatory compliance important? Primarily because they're legally mandatory. Any laboratory that is legally authorized automatically builds trust within the community. Because they follow a set of guidelines, they have to assure quality and public safety and also ensure standardization and data protection. Data protection, like we're going to learn now, is one of the most important aspects of any regulatory compliance. Now we have a laboratory that is legally authorized. It builds trust within the community. It assures quality and public safety and ensures standardization and data protection. It obviously increases the marketability of its business. Hence, the next or the most important part of why it is important is because regulatory compliance helps your lab increase marketability of the business. But with everything that is important also comes certain challenges. Some of the most important or two of the most primary challenges that any laboratory faces while trying to meet regulatory compliance includes it being expensive and time consuming. Why though? Well, to meet a regulatory compliance, you need to have a specific set of infrastructure and specific personnel who will be dedicated to ensuring that you meet all compliance requirements. To set up the infrastructure and hire the employee is actually both time consuming and money consuming. Hence, for any laboratory to meet regulatory compliance, they need to ensure these 2 points, that is expense and the time. Also, we live in a environment, we live in a world that is constantly developing. We live in a world that is constantly driven by innovations and new technologies at every new point. So every compliance needs to change periodically to meet these evolving industry requirements. As such, laboratories also need to be alert and adaptive to the new changes and actively implement them in their laboratory workflows. This comes up as a new challenge, the third or most important challenge for any laboratory when trying to meet regulatory compliance. Now that we have discussed about the challenges and why it is important, let's talk a little bit about some of the best practices that a lab can implement, like you can implement to ensure that you can easily meet these compliance requirements. Starting with, always have a clear determination of the end goals of the laboratories. You should be clear about what is the end goal of your laboratory. Whether you are a testing lab, whether you are a research lab, whether you are a manufacturing unit, you should be extremely clear about your lab's end goals. You should proactively establish policies and procedures that ensure that you meet compliance and quality requirements. You should also have a well documented and communicated code of conduct so that your employees know what behavior is expected out of them. Also, you should have a separate compliance team that would be responsible for meeting the compliance requirements and also proactively collaborate with the rest of the team for effective cross-departmental communication. Your employees should be held accountable based on their information and positions. Employee accountability is important. And you should also have a documentation of any corrective or preventive actions that you take in terms of such accountability. You should also have constant monitoring of all activities performed in the lab. So you should regularly conduct internal audits for continuous monitoring of activities. Also, because you're holding employees accountable and you expect a certain set of responses or behavior from them, you should ensure that they're also compliance trained. In compliance training of employees is extremely important. Your employees should be completely and properly trained so that they know what is to be expected from them. And then adopting a risk-based approach for analysis and management of risks, so that if you come up with an issue or you face an issue, you have a proper risk-based analysis and approach available for it for you to quickly handle and manage that issue. So these are some of the examples of the best practices that you could implement in a laboratory to ensure that you are regulatory and you have met the regulatory compliance. So next we're going to talk about some of the major regulatory compliance across different industries. Starting with, we'll talk about the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance from FDA. We would then move on to the ISO 17025 compliance that is extremely important for any analytical testing lab. We would then talk about some of the important good laboratory practices that would act as guidelines for best lab practices or best practices in the lab. We would then move to some clinical laboratory compliance requirements including GDPR, HIPAA, and CLIA. We would then discuss some biobanking information including the ISO 15189, ISO 20387, and some best practices that ISBER suggests to help your lab meet those regulatory requirements. And then we'll end the discussion talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act and the HFCCP, that is the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point for food laboratories. Starting with, let's talk about the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. The three major requirements of the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance includes confidentiality of electronic records, digital signatures on electronic records, and maintaining an audit trail. A LIMS allows you to easily maintain or manage all records in an electronic format. For every record that is present in the LIMS, every user who accesses that record could be provided with a role-based user access permission, which means only users who have the access information or access permission under your laboratory's hierarchy will be able to access that electronic record. For the rest of them, it will be hidden or blocked off. Even for users who have access permission, they will require to authenticate their permission by digitally signing in into the system and providing a valid set of reasons before they could access the electronic records. And all of these activities will be recorded in an audit trail that will be available at any point of time for internal audits and checking what has happened at what point of time and who performed the activity. Moving on, we'll talk about the most requirement for any analytical testing lab, that is the IQ 17025 requirements. It could be broadly classified into three different requirements: management, resource, and personal. Starting with, let's talk about the management requirements. The management requirements pertain to the operation and effectiveness of the quality management system within a lab. This includes the control of records, internal audits, organizational structure, document control, and purchasing services and supplies. Like we just discussed, a LIMS allows you to easily control all the records that you have in the lab via electronic media. You can organize the users based on organizational structure, and only limit or access information or access permissions can be limited based on the user's position in the lab's hierarchy or a business's hierarchy. And then every activity can be internally recorded by the internal audits, and they can be referenced to at any point of time requirement. Next, we come to document control. So why is document control important? We are living in the COVID era. Everything is changing. The protocols for testing are changing. Protocols for handling samples are changing. Protocols for workflows are changing. Guidelines of expected behavior is changing. So in this changing world, where you have new guidelines, you have updated SOPs, you have new workflows and methodologies, it is very important that your laboratory users have access to all of these documents. It is also important that every document accessible to these users be properly reviewed before being made published or made accessible to the users. This is where a LIMS comes in. LIMS allows you to manage all the documents at one place, update versions of the documents as and when required, and also you provide access to the user for these documentations per the requirement. LIMS can also help you keep a track of the vendors and services required for purchasing and supplies. Next, we're going to talk about the resource requirements that includes or addresses the competence of staff and instruments. Like we discussed for the challenges, one of the major challenges is to have a set of personnel who are compliance trained. Also, during the best practices we discussed, that is very important to train your employees for them to understand what is expected of them. Also, it is very important that every employee or every instrument or technology that your lab uses is assigned to an employee who is skilled enough to handle that, or assigned to a personnel who is skilled enough to handle that. A LIMS allows you to keep a track of all of your staff members in the lab, keep a record of the training history, and also make sure that you mark the level of competency that each of these staff members have in terms of the training history. Also, it allows you to keep a track of all instruments that you have in the lab, along with the individual components. It is very important that instruments are properly calibrated and maintained when you're running a test on them. Otherwise, your results are going to be error-prone. So, a LIMS allows you to keep a track of all the laboratory instruments that you have in the lab, along with the calibration and maintenance cycles, and also alert you whenever the next calibration or maintenance cycle is due. Next, we're going to talk about the process requirements, including addressing sample and testing methodology, the quality and reporting of test and calibration results. This includes test and calibration methods and method validation, ensuring the quality of test calibration results, measure traceability, reporting of results, and review of requests and tenders and contacts. So for any testing laboratories, one of the most important aspects is them receiving a test order. It is very important for them to be able to review all the test orders that they receive and only accept those that tick all the boxes or meet all the requirements that a laboratory has. A LIMS allows you to quickly access all the requests that have been sent in, review them, and only accept those that make sense or that meets all the requirements. Once the test is accepted, you can then integrate LIMS with any analytical instrument to automatically transfer the test results from the instrument into LIMS with minimal inhuman interaction to diminish any human-prone errors. And then once the results are in the system, you can send them for validation. You can set a set of validation workflow, validation rules. You can select multiple test results that you want to send for validation. And then you can select, for each of these tests also, you can select specific or individual verifiers or validating officers who would be responsible for validating these test results. All of this is ultimately going to assure the quality of your final test results. And when they're ready, LIMS allows you to generate custom COA or custom reports so that you can, which meets all of the regulatory requirements that can be released back to the customer. It also allows you to keep a track of the quality of the samples via quality control and detection of trends via trend analysis reports, where you can easily detect trends across different samples and quickly pick out outliers for further action. So here is a quick example of how an audit trail would look like for a LIMS, where you would have information like regarding the activity time and date, actual information about what activity was performed, and the name of the user who is performing that activity. This can be referenced to at any point of time to keep a track of whatever is happening in the laboratory. So it's like a continuous monitoring of all the information, all the processing activities taking place in the lab. And you can use it both for the internal and external audits as well. Moving on, we are next going to talk about GLP, that is the good lab practices, and the main facets of it include quality, measurability, traceability. To talk a little bit more in details, some of the good lab practices that you can follow include following SOPs, that are standard operating procedures, which can be easily made available via a document management module, document management option, proper labeling of reagents. This is extremely important. Imagine a scenario where you have to use a particular reagent, but due to mislabeling of reagent, you end up using something completely different, and your entire test gets messed up. So it's very important that all of your reagents are properly labeled. A LIMS allows you to keep a track of all of the individual reagents that you have in the lab. You can also generate specific barcodes that can be printed into labels that you can use to properly label and then follow a reagent's journey in the laboratory to make sure that proper reagents are used at proper stages. Another important aspect is assigning instruments to skilled analysts. Like you were just talking about, a LIMS allows you to easily keep a track of the personnel that you have, the competency levels, and then according to that, you can assign instruments to these skilled analysts. Calibrating and maintaining instruments, and then reporting of this data in a COA, custom COA, that would meet the regulatory requirements, and also help you to archive or secure archive of the results. Moving on, we'll be talking about some of the important clinical requirements, starting with the EU GDPR, that would be very important for any subject under the European Union. So the three main aspects of the EU GDPR includes maintaining records of all processing activities, which you can easily manage via an audit trail in a LIMS, protecting sensitive information of EU subjects, and authenticating key laboratory activities. So a LIMS allows you to de-identify or desensitize data that you enter. So in case you have a patient information that you need to de-identify or anonymize, a LIMS allows you to do that and restrict information access from any user unless they authenticate that they have authority to access the data, and also they'll have to authenticate a reason as to why they need to access the data. Next, we have the HIPAA compliance that again talks about role-based access permission to staff for safeguarding PHI. So like we just discussed, PHI or protected health information is a very important aspect of any clinical laboratory. So in order to make sure that this data is hidden and patient identification is properly hidden and maintained, it is very important for any laboratory to ensure that PHI data is safeguarded. A LIMS allows you to have a user role-based access permission so that only users who have the authority to access the data will be able to access that. And that way, they can safeguard the PHI from any staff member. LIMS also comes in Audit Trail, and generally any LIMS would come with a proper data encryption system and data security system to ensure that the data is properly secured and only accessed by authorized access permitted users only. Next, we have the CLIA requirements that talks again about document management and how important it is to make sure that all protocols are in place. With the COVID scenario in our side, I think this is very important, especially for laboratories and clinics that are actually handling such important or such sensitive samples. Laboratory inventory management and tracking. So like we were discussing, any lab that has particular reagent systems can be easily tracked, and all reagents and lots can be maintained using the inventory module or inventory management tracking from a LIMS. Quality control and quality assurance. So a LIMS allows you to easily keep a track of any quality control data that you have. And for any of these quality data, you can easily detect trends across samples and then also specify outliers and take a responsible action based on that. And then the instrument calibration maintenance, that as we have seen is a very important part of any compliance requirements and something that can easily be achieved using a LIMS. Because next we will be talking about some of the biobanking requirements, starting with the ISO 15189 compliance requirements. Again, this talks about protecting confidential information, that is the PHI, protected health information, defining user role-based authorities and responsibilities, protecting data and information from unauthorized access, documenting operational details and ensuring accessibility to authorized users only, and validating the system and the test results and the process to retrieve data and information. So all of these requirements we have just discussed, where a LIMS allows you to de-identify sensitive patient information that can only be accessed via a role-based access permission based on a user's authority in the laboratory. All data or all test results uploaded can go through a properly set up validation workflow so that everything is validated, and data can be protected from unauthorized use access based on user's position in the lab's hierarchy. Next, we'll be talking about the ISO 20387 compliance requirements, again for biobanks. And again, it talks about the importance of securing PHI, having an audit trail so that you can record the activities, including the dates and time of all biobanking activities that you're doing in the lab, and maintaining the calibration of equipments, as well as assigning tasks to competent technicians who would be responsible for executing them. Next, we have some best practices that ISBER suggests for biobanks to make sure that they meet these compliance requirements. That includes managing and tracking samples and locating stored samples, an audit trail, and user-based access role permission. A LIMS allows you to track a sample from acquisition till disposal throughout its life cycle in the laboratory. Right from the moment you accept a sample in the lab till the moment it is disposed, shipped off, or destroyed, a LIMS can actually help you track the entire life cycle. Also, in case you're storing a particular sample in the laboratory, because we're talking about biobanks, so storage is a very important aspect. A LIMS allows you to easily keep a track of where a sample is stored in the real life. And when you need to actually pull up the sample information, all you need to do is go to the LIMS, enter the details, it'll tell you where the sample is stored, and you can easily locate that in real time. Because we were talking about PHI, let me show you how a LIMS can help you protect PHI. As you can see, this is a set of information about patients that have been registered under a lab under the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see, the names are hidden out or de-identified. As such, no user will be able to view the information about the patient's name and any other details unless they have access permission or authority to access it. And even then, they'll have to authenticate their access by digitally logging in or digitally signing into the system and putting a valid reason as to why they're accessing it. Next, we're going to talk about some of the food safety management or food safety requirements that food labs require. Before we talk about the different acts or different compliance requirements of any food safety laboratory or food testing lab, let's understand why is it important. Let me give an example of a case that happened around in 2008 and 2009, where approximately 700 people were infected with salmonella infection. This was traced back to the Peanut Corporation of America. So this was traced back by the Peanut Corporation of America to the King Nut brand of peanut butter. As such, once investigators traced the outbreak to a Georgia factory, it resulted in criminal charges against the then CEO of the factory and 2 more employees, and those charges actually included fraud, obstruction of justice, and selling of adulterated food. Another incident happened with JBS Corporation. It's a JBS USA Food Corp. But they had to recall approximately 4,860 pounds of imported boneless beef products. Why? Because the US Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Services, during one of their regular routine inspections, found traces of confirmed positive presence of E. coli in these beef samples. In both the cases, as you can see, one had a recall that affected business, and the other ended up in criminal charges against the CEO. So in both cases, it is established that it is very important that laboratories follow a specific set of food safety regulation and rules to ensure that their food labs have proper standards that can meet the safety regulations and also produce food products that actually meet the regulation requirements and the safety requirements, which is why it's extremely important for any food testing or manufacturing unit to meet the regulatory requirements of the Food Safety Act. 2 of the major food safety acts that we're going to discuss today would include the FSMA and the HFCCP. Talking about the FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, it was instituted in January 2011 by the FDA to allow them to check what protocols, what methods or regulations is a food testing laboratory practicing or food manufacturing unit practicing to ensure that the products are safe for consumption. Some of the important points to remember under the FSMA includes traceability of food samples through the supply chain to ensure data quality and assure safety, addressing and easy tracking of food contamination issues, implementing corrective and preventive measures to eliminate the risk of contamination. So food labs, it is very important to have a complete traceability of samples from farm to fork. A LIMS allows a lab to exactly do that. Also, a LIMS allows a sample to be accessed with a barcode, like maybe a one-dimensional or a two-dimensional barcode, or maybe RFID, that stays with the sample right from farm till the fork, that is right from accessioning till disposal, packaging, or further marketing. And it also allows to easily trace a final product or a packaged product back to the raw material. Easy tracking also includes maintaining a chain of custody that easily tells of laboratory at what point of time which technician was responsible for handling that food item or handling that sample and when it was passed over to the next technician. This easily helps to track the contamination issues and also implement proper corrective and preventive measures based on that information. Next, let's talk about the HFCCP. That includes capturing of sample and test information to prevent or formulate a preventive control plan, document and review all procedures and predefined SOPs, risk assessment through identification of physical, chemical, and biological hazards, self-training, staff training, and competency assessment, and periodic tracking of information related to these incidents. So, to sum it up, LIMS will actually help a lab meet HACCP requirements by being able to completely trace the sample information from acquisition to disposal, track all information related to a test, including when it was ordered, when it was processed, who processed it, who validated it, when it was validated, and any other information regarding the reporting. It will help you keep a track of all of your lab documents at one place for easy review and accession. And then you can also maintain the staff training requirements and make sure that only people who are competent enough are made or are given the responsibility to handle a particular sample. And of course, periodic tracking of everything via the audit trail. So let's see how LIMS actually helps maintain the chain of custody. So as you can see here, there's a small glimpse of how LIMS actually helps maintain chain of custody. So as a sample passes to the lab right from reception or accessioning to testing, packaging, and final release, it goes through multiple hands. LIMS allows you to keep a track of all of these separate or individual people who are handling the sample at what point of time. Also helps you keep a track of when it was transferred and why it was transferred from one technician to another. As such, it's very easy to maintain the chain of custody to track the samples and also implement CAPA or corrective and preventive actions based on these chain of custody details. So that was all about the different regulatory compliance that we have across different industries, and some of the key takeaways that we did or had from today's discussion includes an overview of what the different regulatory compliance and best practices are available for different laboratories across different industries, and how a LIMS can actually help all these laboratories comply with the regulatory requirements and follow the best practices to stay ahead of the curve. So as you can see, the major gist of all of these compliance is proper tracking of samples, managing of documents, ensuring that you have a proper staff that can handle, that is trained enough to handle, and all the instruments are properly recorded, results are validated, and everything is listed and recorded at one place that can be easily and quickly referred to by an auditor. So that was all about this discussion. Thank you for being so patient and listening to me. It was really nice. Thank you and have a nice day.